At some point, we all get taught this goofy idea that the writing process has three very broadly defined steps.
Just plan, write, and revise.
Then you get a grade, put the paper away, and never think about it again. Because certainly the point of writing is to perform a subjective art for an objective grade given by an audience of one, right?
But one of the reasons that people struggle with writing is because the sub-processes hidden in those terms are rarely defined by people other than writers. And as we saw when we looked to writers for advice, they're pretty vague about the work of writing as well.
That's why we're going to use Joe Harris's rewriting to give ourselves a short crash course in the process of writing for an academic audience. Harris's book is broken down into 5 chapters.
Coming to terms, forwarding, countering, taking an approach, and revising.
What Harris gives us here is a tool for understanding the writing process as cyclical.
We read and talk and learn. We figure out which ideas we want to advance and which we want to challenge. We consider our influences and figure out how to reference them, whether that be structurally in how we build the paper or simply by borrowing material or style from them. And then we go all the way back to step 1 by asking ourselves critical questions about our approach to each previous step.
That is to say, when we revise, we're engaging in a somewhat objective critical appraisal of our own work. And that doesn't just mean the writing, the grammar, the word choice. It means the research, the thinking, the arguments.
While we're going to take our closest look at the first and the last chapters of the book, I think it's worth taking a look at all of the quote sheets so that you can get a feel for what the middle matter of the book does as well. This will be especially important for you if you're a person who remains somewhat mystified as to what you're supposed to do with the sources, the secondary sources that you cite and discuss in your paper. If you've ever found yourself just kind of picking and choosing quotes that fit the paper that you've already written, then I think that this process of using forwarding and countering to figure out what you want to say in your paper will be valuable. Here's some highlights that will help us to conceptualize how Harris is asking us to think about writing. He says in Coming to Terms that texts don't simply reveal their meanings to us, that we need to make sense of them. And this has always spoken to me, the idea that reading is not a download, right? You're not just simply consuming information. You are interpreting and analyzing and running that information and the discussion of that information, the context of that information through our own discursive and meaning-making filters. How you understand a text depends basically on who you are. It goes on to say, as soon as you begin to say what you think a text is about, you are involved in rewriting it, in translating its language to your own. This is something that happens implicitly. We don't necessarily know that we're doing it, but if we become conscious of it, then we can express our perspective with greater intention. There's also a quote that comes from forwarding that I think is important to talk about in this context. Every time a student sits down to write for us, they have to invent the university for the occasion. This quote was vexing to me at first. It's been vexing to many of my students over the years, but I think the easiest way to think about it is to think about it in terms of the academy as a collective body of knowledge. The idea is that when you write a paper, you should be creating something new in that body of knowledge. And thus, the study that you're taking on is unique to you, something that only you can bring to this collective body of knowledge. And that's the value of what you're producing. Harris also gives us 3 steps for coming to terms with texts. He asks us to define the project, to think about what the writer is trying to do, then to note key terms and passages, which is where you start to choose what material from the text you think you might want to work with in the creation of your own text. And then he asks us to engage in a critical appraisal of the text itself by assessing its uses and limitations. Notice that Harris doesn't say what the text gets wrong and what the text gets right. He wants us to think about how the text is useful to us in our own work and how it might be limited in helping us accomplish our own work. Once we've gone through that aspect of the process, Harris wants us to think first about ideas from other people that we want to advance and recontextualize in our own work. He says, a writer forwards a text by taking words, images, or ideas from it and putting them to use in new contexts. In forwarding a text, you extend its uses. And this is the connective tissue between this concept and the previous concept. Previously, we were asked to think critically about the text that we have read and consider how it might be useful to us. And then in forwarding the text, we acknowledge that usefulness and make practical use of it. Harris also gives us 4 ways of doing this. Illustrating, which is when you look to other texts for an example of a point you want to make. This could be borrowing some statistics. It could be borrowing a narrative, something that helps you to make a claim or to justify an assumption that you're making. There's also borrowing, which is when you draw on terms or ideas from other writers to use in thinking through your subject. Academia is predicated on using shared language, and we understand one another better when we are sharing language. That doesn't mean that that language and its use is concrete. We can make changes and shifts to how we use language within field and subject area contexts when we borrow that language. However, if we can speak the same language of our peers, then our peers will be better able to understand the usefulness of our work. The tactic you're probably most familiar with is authorizing, when you invoke the expertise or status of another writer to support your own thinking. And this is what you've been asked to do with other sources throughout the bulk of your academic career. This is why you get that red pen mark on your paper that might say something like source with a question mark after or cite with a question mark after. Your instructors are looking for you to authorize your point of view via the authority of other thinkers and writers. This is to some degree valuable. But if we think about it in the context of the previous chapter, I wonder how much it helps us to invent the university for the occasion for which we are writing. I would think that it would inhibit us from doing that if we are solely relying on authorizing in order to express the relationship between our text and other texts that exist in the subject area. And then there's extending, which is when you put your own spin on terms or concepts that you take from other texts. This is probably the most useful in expressing your particular unique perspective on the subject matter. Like we said, the language is flexible. The thinking about the concepts is flexible. So you have to demonstrate that flexibility in your own interpretation of the language and concepts that you're dealing with. Once we've accounted for the uses of our source texts, we also want to think about the limitations of our source texts and how we will employ our acknowledgement. Harris says here, as I use the term to counter is not to nullify, but to suggest a different way of thinking. Its defining phrases are on the other hand and yes but. The idea is that forwarding is yes and. I agree and I want to build on that. Whereas when countering, you are still borrowing something that is useful from that other text, but you're using it to kind of hinge to a point of disagreement. As Harris says, that doesn't mean that you have to nullify the other point. It doesn't mean that you have to sort of argue it into oblivion and show all of the ways in which it is wrong. You want to acknowledge how that point influenced your thinking and then explain how your thinking diverges from the thinking of the person who originally made the point. He says here that countering looks at other views and texts not as wrong, but as partial. And this is an incredibly important acknowledgement. None of us has total knowledge. None of our arguments will be ironclad. We will always have points of disagreement with one another because, as we indicated in the first chapter of the book, we all see things differently from different perspectives. Harris gives us 3 ways of countering. The first is arguing the other side, in which you show the usefulness of terms or ideas that another writer has criticized, or note problems with one that another writer has argued for. In uncovering values, we surface a word or concept for analysis that the text is left undefined or unexamined. So, for example, you might read a paper about algorithmic justice that makes clear the relationship between algorithmic justice and misogyny, but doesn't really deal with the intersection between algorithmic justice and race, and how all of those concepts are intertwined and related. And you may want to use that text as a jumping off point for talking about those concepts. Lastly, there's dissenting, which is identifying a shared line of thought in order to note its limits. So here you're essentially saying, I agree, but only to a certain point. There are still aspects of this particular topic on which I diverge from your point of view. Harris then gives us taking an approach. Rather than focusing on quotes here, I want to focus on the 3 tactics that Harris gives us, which acknowledging influences, noting those writers whose work has in some way provided a model for your own. This could be a very concrete thing. You might be working directly off of somebody else's text to create your own. Intertextuality is huge in literature. For instance, the postmodern play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead could not exist without its source material, Hamlet. The play retells the story of Hamlet from the perspective of 2 very minor characters in the play who don't get very much stage time at all. So obviously, Hamlet is a massive influence on Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, and so the writers of that play must acknowledge that influence. You can also turn an approach on itself, which is asking the same questions of a writer that he or she asks of others. Again, to use the algorithmic justice example, maybe you feel like there isn't enough attention to intersectionality in the discussion of that topic. And while the other writer is advocating for people to be aware of algorithmic justice and what it means, you are seeing their discussion of it as partial or incomplete, and you are trying to build on that discussion. Lastly, there's reflexivity, which is noting and reflecting on the key choices you have made concerning method, values, and language in constructing your text. These methods, values, and language may not necessarily be your own. You may borrow a value system from someone else. You may use their terms. You may try to replicate a kind of experiment that they've done. In any case, you want to make sure that you're making clear what work is yours and what work comes from others. And lastly, Harris covers revising, which is our main focus for this project. Harris first says, revising is thus a particular form of what throughout this book I've called rewriting. It names the work of returning to a draft of a text you've written in order to make your thinking, not your writing, your thinking in it, more nuanced, precise, suggestive, and interesting. This is what we mean when we say that the writing process is cyclical and reflexive. It's ongoing. It doesn't necessarily end. Just because you've turned a paper in and received a grade, that's not the end of the intellectual exercise. At some point, you want to return to those ideas because they should be important to you. They should be interesting to you in one way or another. They should pique your curiosity in a way that makes you want to say more about them or speak to a different audience about them. This is the step that most student writers avoid and ignore because they're frankly not taught to do this at all. This is also the limitation of teaching writing for a grade. If the grade is the endpoint, then the project has an endpoint. But if there is no grade, there is no endpoint, and your work can continue. It's in the continuation of this work that people go from undergraduate students who are performing in classes for grades to graduate students and academic professionals who are trying to publish their work as a means of making a living. Harris also says another way to put this is to say that finished texts conceal much of the labor involved in writing them. He says it can seem as though other writers work without blotting a line, confidently progressing through their text from start to finish, as if they were speaking them aloud. This is the illusion of writing. This is the authorial illusion that we all buy into when we call certain authors geniuses. If you could read their first drafts, you would not think that they were geniuses. In this way, Harris also helps us understand that when we communicate in an academic context, although so much of our ethos is wrapped up in this idea of credibility, we're not really doing the work of academics if we feel completely sure about what we're expressing. The idea that this thinking should be challenging in one way or another is critical. That we should have moments of uncertainty, moments that lack clarity, moments that lack insight. These are all critical to producing new knowledge. And when we share those moments of difficulty with other writers and thinkers, they can help us to approach that difficulty from a different perspective. But the main idea of the chapter is to reveal all of that labor that is concealed and to order our process of revision differently. Harris doesn't want us to think about revision as just fixing the cosmetic issues with our work. He says the changes you make in editing tend to be ad hoc and local. That to edit is to fine-tune a document, with proofreading being the extreme case in which you simply correct typos or mistakes in punctuation. But he also says that simply editing or proofreading a text that needs to be rethought and revised is like waxing a car that needs repairs to its engine. A music producer I used to work with had a saying, garbage in, garbage out. He could make your performances sound good. He could make your recording sound good. But if you came to him with bad songs, you were still going to leave the studio with good sounding bad songs. So that is to say, when we're revising, we shouldn't just be thinking about correcting mistakes. We shouldn't just be thinking about the cosmetic aspects of the text. We should be returning to our original impetuses for writing and rethinking every aspect of our approach. In doing so, we'll discover that there are aspects of our text that we want to amplify more. We will, in that way, forward ourselves in the revising of our text. We'll also discover that there are aspects of the text that are limited, and in that way, we will counter the limits of our own work in revising our text.
And in order to create context for our revisions, we'll be using a specific call for papers that will constrain to some degree the rhetorical situation, which will help us determine our audience. And that acknowledgement of audience should give us some pretty good ideas for how to approach the revision of the paper. In any case, this will be different for each of us, depending on the specific call that we choose to respond to.